Page 130. So what is the answer? How can you stand your ground when you are weak and sensitive to pain? When people you love are still alive? When you are unprepared? What do you need to make you stronger than the interrogator and the whole trap? From the moment you go to prison, you must put your cozy past firmly behind you. At the very threshold, you must say to yourself, my life is over. A little early, to be sure, but there's nothing to be done about it. I shall never return to freedom. I am condemned to die, now or a little later. But later on, in truth, it will be even harder, and so the sooner the better. I no longer have any property whatsoever. For me, those I love have died, and for them I have died. From today on, my body is useless and alien to me. Only my spirit and my conscience remain precious and important to me. Confronted by such a prisoner, the interrogation will tremble. Only the man who has renounced everything can win that victory. But how can one turn one's body to stone? Well, they managed to turn some individuals from Berdyaev's circle into puppets for a trial, but they didn't succeed with Berdyaev. They wanted to drag him into an open trial. They arrested him twice, and in 1922 he was subjected to a night of interrogation by Dzerzhinsky himself. Kamenev was there too, which means that he too was not averse to using the Cheka in an ideological conflict. But Berdyaev did not humiliate himself. He did not beg or plead. He set forth firmly those religious and moral principles which had led him to refuse to accept the political authority established in Russia. And not only did they come to the conclusion that he would be useless at trial, they liberated him. A human being has a point of view. And Stolyarova recalls an old woman who was her neighbor on the Buterki bunks in 1937. They kept on interrogating her every night. 2 years earlier, a former metropolitan of the Orthodox Church who had escaped from exile had spent a night with her on his way home through Moscow. But he wasn't the former metropolitan, he was the metropolitan. Truly, I was worthy of receiving him. All right then, to whom did he go when he left Moscow? I know, but I won't tell you. The metropolitan had escaped to Finland via an underground railroad of believers. At first, the interrogators took turns, and they went after her in groups. They shook their fists at the little old woman's face, and she replied, "There is nothing you can do to me, even if you cut me into pieces. After all, you are afraid of your bosses, and you are afraid of each other, and you are even afraid of killing me." They would lose contact with the Underground Railroad. But I am not afraid of anything. I would be glad to be judged by God right this minute. There were such people in 1937 too, people who did not return to their cell for their bundles of belongings, who chose death, who signed nothing, denouncing anyone. One can't say that the history of the Russian revolutionaries has given us any better examples of steadfastness, but there is no comparison anyway. None of our revolutionaries ever knew what a really good interrogation could be, with 52 methods to choose from. Ch.3 did not subject Radishev to torture, and because of contemporary custom, Radishev knew perfectly well that his sons would serve as officers in the Imperial Guard no matter what happened to him, and that their lives wouldn't be cut short, nor would anyone confiscate Radishev's family estate. Nonetheless, in the course of his brief 2-week interrogation, this outstanding man renounced his beliefs and his books and begged for mercy. Nicholas I didn't have enough imagination to arrest the wives of the Decembrists and compel them to scream in the interrogation room next door, or even torture the Decembrists themselves, but in any case he didn't need to. Even Rylev fully, frankly, and hid nothing. Even Pestel broke down and named comrades, who were still free, assigned to bury Ruskaya Pravda in the very place where it had been buried. There were very few like him, like Lunin, expressed disdain and contempt for the investigating commission. The majority behaved badly and got one another more deeply involved. Many of them begged abjectly to be pardoned. Zavalishyn put all the blame on Rylev. Obolensky and Trubetskoy couldn't wait to slander Griboyedov, which even Nicholas I didn't believe. Bakunin and his confessions abjectly groveled before Nicholas I, thereby avoiding execution. Was this wretchedness of soul or revolutionary cunning? One would think that those who decided to assassinate Alexander II must have been people of the highest selflessness and dedication. After all, they knew what the stakes were. Grunievitsky shared the fate of the Tsar, but Rysakov remained alive and was held for interrogation. And that very day he blabbed on the participants in the plot and identified their secret meeting places. Out of fear for his young life, he rushed to give the government more information than he could ever have been suspected of having. He nearly choked with repentance. He proposed to expose all the secrets of the anarchists. At the end of the last century, and at the beginning of this one, the Tsarist interrogator immediately withdrew his question if the prisoner found it appropriate, inappropriate, or too intimate. But in Krusty Prison in 1938, when the old political hard labor prisoner Zelensky was whipped with ramrods with his pants pulled down like a small boy, he wept in his cell. My Tsarist interrogator didn't even dare address me rudely. Or, for example, we learned from recently published research that the Tsarist gendarmes seized the manuscript of Lenin's essay, What Are Our Ministers Thinking Of? but was unable to get at its author. At the interrogation, the gendarmes, just as one might have expected, learned very little from the student Vaneyev. The italics here and throughout this quotation are my own, if you can see it on the screen. He informed them only that the manuscripts found at this place had been brought to him in one packet for safekeeping several days before the search and by a certain person whom he did not wish to name. Therefore, the interrogator's sole alternative was to turn the manuscript over for expert analysis. The experts learned nothing. What did he mean, his sole alternative? What about icy water up to the ankles, or a saltwater douche, or Ryumin's truncheon? It would seem that the author of this article, Peresvedov, himself served time for several years and might easily have enumerated what alternatives the interrogator actually had when confronting the guardian of Lenin's What Are Ministers Thinking Of? As Malganov recollects, that was a Tsarist prison, a prison of a blessed memory, which political prisoners nowadays can only recall with a feeling of almost gladness. But that is just a case of displaced concepts. The yardstick is totally different. Just as oxcart drivers of Gogol's time could not have imagined the speed of a jet plane, those who have never gone through the receiving line meat grinder of Gulag cannot grasp the true possibilities of interrogation. We read in Izvestia for May 24, 1959, that Yulipa Rumyasveta was confined in the internal prison of a Nazi camp while they tried to find out from her the whereabouts of her husband, who had escaped from that same camp. She knew, but she refused to tell. For a reader who is not in the know, this is a model of heroism. For a reader with the bitter Gulag past, it's a model of an inefficient interrogation. Yulia did not die under torture, and she was not driven insane. A month later, she was simply released, still very much alive and kicking. All these thoughts about standing firm as a rock were quite unknown to me in February 1945. Not only was I not in the least prepared to cut my cozy ties with earth, I was even quite angry for a long time because 100 or so Faber pencils had been taken away from me when I was arrested. Looking back on my interrogation from my long subsequent imprisonment, I had no reason to be proud of it. I might have borne myself more firmly, and in all probability I could have maneuvered more skillfully, but my first weeks were characterized by a mental blackout and a slump into depression. The only reason these recollections do not torment me with remorse is that, thanks be to God, I avoided getting anyone else arrested, but I came close to it. Although we were frontline soldiers, Nikolai, 5th and 1st, who were involved in the same case, got ourselves into prison through a piece of childish stupidity. He and I corresponded through the war between two sectors on the front, and though we knew perfectly well that wartime censorship of correspondence was in effect, we indulged in fairly outspoken expressions of our political outrage and in derogatory comments about the wisest of the wise, whom we labeled with the transparently obvious nickname of Pahan, or ringleader of the thieves. When later on I reported our case in various prisons, our naivete aroused only laughter and astonishment. Other prisoners told me that two more stupid jackasses couldn't exist, and I became convinced of that myself. Then suddenly, one day, learning some documents on the case of Alexander Ulyanov, Lenin's elder brother, I learned that he and his Confederates got caught in the exact same way, a careless exchange of letters, and that was the only reason Alexander III didn't die on March 1st, 1887. My interrogator, Yesipov, was high-ceilinged, spacious, and bright, with an enormous window. The Rossiya Insurance Company had not been built with torture in mind, and putting to use its 17 feet of height, a full-length, vertical 13-foot portrait of that powerful sovereign hung there toward whom I, a grain of sand that I was, had expressed my hatred. Sometimes the interrogator stood in front of the portrait and declaimed dramatically, "We are ready to lay down our lives for him. We are ready to lie down in the path of oncoming tanks for his sake." Face to face with the altar-like grandeur of that portrait, my mumblings about some kind of purified Leninism seemed pitiful, and I myself seemed a blasphemous slanderer deserving only death. The contents of our letters provided more than enough, in keeping with the standards of those times, to sentence us both. Therefore, my interrogator did not have to invent anything. He merely tried to cast his noose around everyone I had ever written to or received a letter from. I had expressed myself vehemently in letters to friends my own age, and had been almost reckless in spelling out seditious ideas, but my friends for some reason had continued to correspond with me, and some suspicious phrases could be found in their replies to my letters. And then Yezipov, like Porfiry Petrovich, demanded that I explain it all in a coherent way. If we had expressed ourselves in such a fashion in letters that we knew were subject to censorship, what could we have said to each other face to face? I could not convince him that all my fire-eating talk was confined to my letters, and at that point, with muddled mind, I had to undertake to weave something credible about my feelings with my friends. Meetings referred to in my letters. What I said had to jibe with the letters in such a way as to be on the very edge of political matters, and yet not to fall under the criminal code. Moreover, these explanations had to pour forth quickly, all in one breath, so as to convince this veteran interrogator of my naivety, my humility, and my total honesty. The main thing was not to provoke my lazy interrogator to any interest in looking through that accursed load of stuff I had brought in my sacred suitcase, including many notebooks of my war diary written in hard, light pencil in a needle-thin handwriting, with some of the notes already partially washed out. These diaries constituted my claim to becoming a writer. I had not believed in the capacities of our amazing memory, and I had, throughout the war years, I had tried to write down everything that I saw. That would have been only half a catastrophe. I also wrote down everything I heard from other people, but opinions and stories, which were so natural on front lines, seemed to be treasonable here in the rear, and reeked of raw imprisonment for my frontline comrades. So to prevent that interrogator from going to my war diary and mining it for a whole case against a free frontline tribe, I repented just as much as I had to, and pretended to see the light and reject my political mistakes. I became utterly exhausted from this balancing on a razor's edge, until I recognized that no one was being hauled in for confrontation with me, and distinguished the clear signs that the interrogation was drawing to an end. Until, in the 4th month, all the notebooks of my war diary were cast into the hellish maw of the Lubyanka furnace, where they burst into flame, the red pyre of one more novel which had perished in Russia, and flew out of the highest chimney in black butterflies of soot. We used to walk in the shadow of that chimney, our exercise yard, a box-like concrete enclosure on the roof of the big Lubyanka 6 floors up. The walls rose around us to approximately 3 times a man's height. With our own ears we could hear Moscow, automobile horns honking back and forth, but all we could see was that chimney, the guard posted in its 7th floor tower, and that regiment of God's heaven whose unhappy fate it was to float over the Lubyanka. Oh, that soot! It kept falling on us, on and on in that first post-war May. So much of it fell during each of our walks that we decided the Lubyanka must be burning countless years of files. My doomed diary was only one momentary plume of that soot. I recalled a frosty sunny morning in March when I was sitting in the interrogator's office. He was asking his customary crude questions and writing down my answers, distorting my words as he did so. The sun played in the melting latticework on the frost on the wide window, through which at times I felt very much like jumping, so as to flash through Moscow at least one more time, in death, smash onto the sidewalk 5 ports below, Just as in my childhood, my unknown predecessor had jumped from Ch.3 and must have on the dawn. In the gaps where the frost had melted, rooftops of Moscow could be seen, rooftop after rooftop, and above them merry little puffs of smoke. I was staring not in that direction, but at a mound of piled-up manuscripts, someone else's, covering the entire center of the floor in this half-empty room, 36 square yards in area. Manuscripts which had been dumped there a little while before and had not yet been examined. In notebooks, in file folders, in homemade binders, in tied and untied bundles, and simply in loose pages. Manuscripts lay there like a burial mound of some interred human spirit, its conical top rearing higher than the interrogator's desk, almost blocking me from his view. And brotherly pity ached in me for the labor of that unknown person who had been arrested on the previous night. These spoils from the search of his premises having been dumped that very morning on the parquet floor of the torture chamber, at the feet of that 13-foot stallion. I sat there and I wondered, whose extraordinary life had they brought in for torment, for dismemberment, and then for burning? How many ideas and works had perished in that building, a whole lost culture. Oh, soot stood from the Lubyanka chimneys. And the most hurtful thing of all was that our descendants would consider our generation more stupid, less gifted, less vocal than in actual fact it was. Thank you for listening. Good night.